All right, guys, how you doing? Um, Wanted today to start talking about marriage and kinship. There's zombie back there taking a little nap. Um, today I just wanted to do some more or less definitional things with you, go over a few terms with you. But I wanted to, let me move myself out of the way here for a second. My mouse batteries are low. All right, I wanted to just talk about this opening page, this opening page I have here, okay, because it tells us something about marriage and kinship and family and so on. So over here, um, let me see here, let's do, how about do red. All right, so over here, we got a happily married Kung family, our old buddies, the Kung. Have another happy family here. Have a wedding ceremony here, all right? And we have this gentleman here with his four wives, okay? And we have this woman here with her two husbands, okay? And so, one of the things that I think all of these pictures show us is that there's a great deal of cultural diversity over or around the whole idea of marriage and around the whole idea of what a family is. So over back here again, um, we have this guy with his four wives. This is an example of um, not just polygamy in general, but polygyny. One man marrying more than one woman. And over here we have a woman married to more than one man, so that is what we call polyandry. Okay, and in fact, this picture right down here in the lower middle, this is a picture of what we call fraternal polyandry, which we'll get to in a while. But you have an article. In fact, these people are from Tibet, and one of the articles you have to read is called "When Brothers Take a Wife." And we'll explain what fraternal polyandry is. But again, I mean, all this stuff here shows that there's a great deal of cultural diversity, I think, surrounding the whole idea of marriage. And we're going to even have to talk about some of the problems we run into when we try to define marriage. And there's a lot of cultural diversity in terms of defining what it is exactly a family is. Now, over here, these pictures on the right, I mean, what do they show us, right? What this picture shows us and what this picture shows us is that kinship and marriage are contested. Just like today, right now, we are, I think, engaged in a kind of a culture war in our society over what exactly marriage is or what exactly marriage should be. Uh, so, here we're talking about or we're debating over what constitutes a marriage. Is a marriage between a man and a woman, or can we have marriages between people of the same sex? That's the battle we're fighting in our own culture right now. But down here's another example of the political contest, right, over marriage and family. Where these women are protesting the custom and the law of polygamy. So, moving on. All right. Let me get down here. All right. Okay. So, don't worry about this diagram here. All right. Don't worry about that diagram there. Keep doing that. Sorry about that. That is just there to illustrate to you how anthropologists deal with kinship. I'm trying to make the point right here that kinship and marriage are of very great importance to anthropologists. Maybe you remember when Napoleon Shagnon goes down to visit or to study the Yanomamo, that one of the things he's interested in there is their entire system of kinship. And remember when they played that trick on him, he was trying to record kinship relations. Wait, can you hear Zombie? She's snoring. Yeah, she's snoring. She stopped. Okay. All right. So marriage and kinship are of great importance to anthropologists. Now, why? Why? Well, I make this point here, right, that there's an important difference between indigenous societies or traditional societies and modern industrial societies. One of the big differences has to do with the way those societies are organized. So I say here on this slide that in indigenous, traditional, or folk societies, the organizing principle of those societies is kinship, right? That kinship in these kinship systems, right, in these societies are multifunctional. The institution of kinship is multifunctional. And, that's because there isn't a whole lot of institutional specialization in those societies. We have a great deal of institutional specialization. We have a political system that's separate from the family, which is separate from religion, right, which is separate from the economy, et cetera, et cetera. We have this institutional specialization almost along the lines of how functionalists talk about, society as that organic system. Now, what I'm saying here is that in traditional or folk societies, that the organizing principle is kinship. That what I mean there is that kinship becomes an all-encompassing institution under which all other aspects of life, all other kinds of life activities become organized. So, for example, if we were looking at an agricultural society, if we're looking at, for example, a system of peasant agriculture, production is organized within the family, right? The family is in fact a unit of production, and the family becomes a little labor force. So people's relationship to the entire society is going to be defined by their relationship to family. Everything becomes about family, right? And kinship ties. That's going to include economic life, political life, where you are in the society politically. It's going to include things like religion, what family you belong to and what your place in that family is might define your ritual responsibilities to the rest of the community, and so on. So that's what I mean when I say that kinship is the organizing principle of traditional, indigenous, or folk societies, whatever we want to call them. And as we go along here, as we get further into this, I'm going to try to illustrate how all those different areas of life, political, economic, religious, how they all kind of come together into the organization of the family. Now, the difference then between these traditional societies and modern societies like ours, or an industrial or a post-industrial society, is that kinship is no longer the organizing principle of our society, right? Or of societies like ours. Used to be, but it's not anymore. It's not to say that family isn't important anymore, that it still doesn't serve an important role in society, but it is not the organizing principle of society. In a modern society, the organizing principle is bureaucracy, right? Bureaucracy becomes the organizing principle. Our institutions are functionally specialized, and they are organized bureaucratically. So that's the reason why anthropologists place such an emphasis on kinship, is because if anthropologists are focusing on studying indigenous and folk societies, then in order to understand those societies, we have to look at them from the point of view of kinship. All right, so this is where we're going to get to talking about some introductory terms. And I just have a couple of pictures up here. So over here on the Over here on the left, that's me and my beautiful wife, Andrea. And there we are with the Hudson River behind us, enjoying a beautiful day up in New York. And on the right here, oops, I didn't mean to do that. On the right here, this is my parents, Mike and Rose Santoro. And this is, look at my dad rocking that kind of leisure suit sort of jacket there. And my mom with the fake leather jacket on too. Those really classic 1970s fashion there. And this is them in 1978 when they won. My dad won $50,000 in the New Jersey lottery. So very happy day. And I just have there's a lot of my pictures in this presentation are more or less mood setters, so they're there to set a mood. Okay, so some introductory terminology. We're just going to run down the list. So first of all, we have the idea of consanguines, or maybe the way we could call it is we could talk about consanguineous relatives. So who are your consanguineous relatives? Well, the word consanguineous means related by blood. Okay, so we talk about consanguineous relatives. Those are relatives that you are related to by blood, right? As opposed to some other way. What's another way you can be related to somebody? Well, you can be related to somebody through marriage, right? And we call those people we are related to by marriage, we call them affines, right? Or affinous relatives. That word will come up a couple times in our presentation. All right, so next term on the list is fictive kin. So who are our fictive kin? Well, I have to refer to my notes here just so I make sure I get this straight. And I'm sure if you think about it, you may, some of you have fictive kin relationships in your life. So the definition of fictive kin, which we can also call chosen kin, right? Or we could also call them voluntary kin, okay? That these are people who are not related by blood, right? And they are not related by marriage, but they are treated as if they were family members, right? So some of you, like I said, might have these kinds of relationships in your family. If you are referring to maybe a close friend of one of your parents as aunt or uncle, that's an example of a fictive kin relationship. Now, there are other kinds of fictive kin relationships. We can call these pseudo families. And if we put that word pseudo, P-S-E-U-D-O, if we put that prefix pseudo right in front of a word, it means almost, right, or kind of like something. So we have these things that resemble families but aren't really families, and maybe they fall more under the category of fictive kin. An example of a fictive kin relationship would be, among, and some of you may be familiar with this too, among spouses of military men and women. Sometimes spouses of military men and women create these networks with each other, which become really, really tight, very close bonds, very closely knit bonds. These relationships, these closely bound relationships that they form with each other, and that these relationships might facilitate support, right, and be beneficial during times of hardship, and they take on the significance of family relationships. Now, you also have an article that you have to read by Marjorie Wolf about uterine families. So her discussion, right, of uterine families might be considered a type of pseudo family and fall under the category of fictive kin. Okay. Now, the next one we get to is the idea of social parenthood. Right? That's another important idea, social parenthood. Now, what social parenthood is telling us is that there's really a difference, isn't there, between, for example, somebody being your biological father. You know, here's my biological father over here. Let me, there's my, whoops, hold on. I'm still getting the hang of this shit here. So here's my, here's my biological father. All right. Now, there's a difference between somebody being your biological father and somebody being your social father. In other words, a person could have a biological father that they never knew, that they may never know their whole life, and yet have what we call a social father, right? A person who plays the role, who steps into that role, right, as father, and would be considered by that person to be more of a father than their biological father ever would. So we have the notion here that what this is, what this is telling us, right, is that social parenthood can be separated from biological parenthood. Not always, but sometimes. Like for me, fortunately, my biological father was also my social father. My biological mother was also my social mother, right? But those are really two different things incorporated into the same person, but sometimes they're separated, right? So that what it tells us, the fact of social parenthood tells us that the most important thing about kinship, right? The most important thing about kinship in general is that family and kinship involves a universe of socially and culturally constructed roles, right? A universe of culturally and socially constructed roles. Father, mother, these are social roles. We create them. These are culturally constructed roles. We create them. Okay? And like I said, sometimes those two roles are those two things, but the biological and the social are incorporated in one person, but other times they aren't. Okay. I hope you follow what I'm trying to say here, because that idea of social parenthood is going to come up again at different times during our presentation here. Okay. So the next idea here we get to is the family. What is a family? I wanted to read a definition from Kathleen Guth, okay, Gough, Kathleen Guth, and she says that a family is a married couple or other group of adult kinfolk who cooperate economically and in the upbringing of children, and all or most of whom share a common dwelling. Okay. So that's a family. Married couple or other group of adult kinfolk, because marriage doesn't necessarily involve a couple, as we saw from the opening slide, right? We have the reality of polygamy. Okay. So a married couple or some other group of adult kinfolk, and they cooperate economically, and they cooperate in the upbringing of children. And most of the time, they also share a common dwelling, right? Okay. All right, everybody good? So that's the way we would define a family in general. Now we get nuclear family. What's a nuclear family? Well, a nuclear family refers to a married couple and their unmarried children. So nuclear family, married couple, and their unmarried children. And then we get extended family, right? The idea of an extended family. And so one way to just think about the extended family is, well, these are the relatives beyond the nuclear family. So when, we talk about you and your mommy and your daddy, right? That's your nuclear, for you, your mommy and your daddy and your brothers and sisters, that's your nuclear family. But when we start to talk about your grandparents and your your grandparents and your aunts and your uncles and your first cousins and your second cousins and so on, now we're moving out, and that's your extended family. Okay. And then finally, we get to this idea of a household. So a household refers to one or more nuclear, one, I'm screwing this all up. Well, let me just read this definition here. A household is a group of people who occupy a common dwelling, right? A household is a group of people who occupy a common dwelling. So, household and family don't necessarily correlate completely, right? So you could have people living who are unrelated living in the same dwelling, right? And they are a household. So a family could be a household, but not necessarily. So if you were sharing an apartment with some of your fellow students, right? You'd be a household, but you wouldn't necessarily be a family. Okay? All right. So that's all I wanted to do right now. And when we come back in our next part, we're going to talk about marriage. We're going to talk about what marriage is and what some of the issues are, or what kind of issues arise when we try to define what marriage is. Okay? All right. So